Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. So nice to see so many of you here and welcome. So we have a very special session lined up today. It's held in conjunction with two things. One is an exhibition, Chua Mia Tee directing the rail on level 4. If you haven't already seen it, do visit. It's really a lovely exhibition. And the other thing is a writers program that we have. It's a Poets in Residence program. So every year or so, we invite a poet to come and spend several months at the gallery, during which time they are free to find inspiration from any aspect of the gallery. I think we'll all agree that the gallery is really a very, very inspiring place. Now, this program is in its third run, and we are very fortunate today to have all three poets in residence here presenting their poetry. Our current poet in residence, Koh Buck Song, whom we really have to thank for today's session, and our first two poets in residence, Edwin Thumboo and Madeline Lee. And they are joined by Isa Kamari and Lee Pheng. So you can see we are in for a real treat today. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to hand over to our moderator, Yong Shu Hoong, who will start the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine, for that introduction. So as mentioned, I'm going to be the moderator for this afternoon. Basically, what we'll be having is that we're going to have all the featured poets here to share some of their poems that they have written in response to Chua Mia Tee's paintings and also this idea of social realism. So later on, I will introduce them before they do their readings. And then after that, we'll open up for a panel discussion and we'll talk more about the paintings and inspiration and poetry and social realism. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a round of introductions for our poets to welcome them. Maybe what I'll do is that I will very briefly introduce them with a bit of their info from their bios. When I say brief, it's not to like de-emphasize their achievements, but because they're so accomplished and in their fields of writings and all that, I thought that I will keep things brief. If not, we'll be stuck here for half an hour just listening to their bios. Maybe we'll just reserve we'll wait till I've introduced everybody before we give them a round of applause. I'm going to introduce Buck Song first, seated right next to me on my left. Koh Buck Song is, as Elaine has mentioned, the current poet in residence here at the National Gallery. And he is the author and editor of more than 30 books, including 6 books of poetry and Haiger art, which I feel could be a separate talk altogether about Haiger that he's quite interested in right now. Actually, before meeting Buck Song in person, I've already been reading his columns in the Straits Times way back in the 90s, I think. Yeah, so that was how long ago. Next to Buck Song is Madeline Lee. Of course, something that we have in common is that we both have works published under First Fruits. Madeline is an investment manager who also writes poetry. She has published 11 books of poetry in English to date, as well as one bilingual title with poems translated into Chinese. So she was the first poet in residence here at the National Gallery. Next to Madeline is Isa Kamari. Isa has written 11 novels, 3 collections of poetry, a collection of short stories, a book of essays on Singapore Malay poetry, a collection of theatre scripts and lyrics of 3 song albums. He was conferred the Southeast Asia Right Award in 2006 and the Singapore Cultural Medallion in 2007, among other accolades. Next, we have Lee Pheng. Pheng was actually teaching at National University of Singapore, and she retired as associate professor of English literature, where at NUS, where she had taught for 32 years. She is the author of 7 collections of poetry, including Prospect of a Drowning and The Brink of an Armed Man, among others. She received the Singapore Cultural Medallion for Literature in 1985 and the Southeast Asia Wright Award in 1987, among other awards. Last but not least, at the other end of the lineup, we've got Prof Tambu, who basically needs no introduction, but I'm going to just give a very brief intro. Prof Tambu is Emeritus Professor at Department of English, Language and Literature at the National University of Singapore, where he was previously Dean of Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and also the Director of Center for the Arts. He has received the Singapore Cultural Medallion in 1980, among many other awards and medals, and he was the 2nd poet in residence at National Gallery. So shall we give them a round of applause to welcome them? So what I'm going to do next is to just basically signal to all the various poets to share their readings. And when they read their poems, I would invite them to also share a little bit about their inspirations, based on looking at certain paintings by Chua Mia Tee and other thoughts that they may have in mind. And I think it's going to be a treat to hear them read their poems and also share a little bit about their inspiration. So to kick the event off, I'm going to get Buck Song to share his poems.
Right. Thank you very much, Shu Hoong. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming to join us on this beautiful wintry Sunday in this magnificent space. This afternoon, I thought we could consider the connections between art, poetry, and social realism. Now, if you were to look up social realism online, you will find in its Wikipedia entry a listing of some 100 artists around the world. Most of the artists in this list are American. There are a couple of Filipinos, South Koreans, Indians, but only one Singaporean, Chua Mia Tee. And this is just one of the many ways in which Mr. Chua is a special Singapore artist. Now, the social realism that inspired his art in the 1950s and 60s was driven by larger forces, including the anti-colonialism movement and the desire to forge a new Malayan national identity. By the time of the 1970s, with Singapore newly independent, these larger forces had changed to include rapid urbanization and dislocations that arise from economic growth. But through all this time, there is one common thread in the social realism that influenced Mr. Chua's art, and that is the turning of the spotlight on some of the least advantaged members of society, people like construction workers, laborers, and so on. And Mr. Chua always had a deep affinity for these workers. So in a way, he was showing us, long before the phrase became famous in this country, that this is what inequality looks like. So in this and other ways, Mr. Chua is my kind of artist, the kind of artist who has something important to say, a message, if you like. And this aspect is also a feature of the kind of poetry that I'm most drawn to, the kind of poetry that has something urgent to convey. And this is how I came to think of an event like this afternoon, this multilingual poetry reading, having a few Singapore poets to come together to take a closer look again at the art of Chua Mia Tee, and to together with you in the audience to consider anew the connections between art, poetry, and social realism. So I'm going to read two poems. The first poem is titled Close Quarters, Chinatown. It was first published in 1994. It was one of a dozen poems that were commissioned by my artist friend Ong Kim Seng for the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Singapore Watercolor Society, of which he was the president at that time. This particular poem is a companion poem to the painting Courtyard by Ku Jiang Jin, an artist who now lives in Malaysia, and is included in the book 25 Years of Watercolor Painting in Singapore, which is available in the National Gallery's Rotunda Library just upstairs to our left. The poem employs mathematical metaphors, a set of extended mathematical metaphors to describe how the inhabitants of Chinatown used to live at such a high density among such diverse neighbors. The poem was published 28 years ago, but it contains an insight on racial harmony, which I found to be vital and still so relevant today, that I included this insight and featured the poem in its entirety in the closing chapter of a book that I edited, which was launched last month, titled One United People, Essays from the People Sector on Singapore's Journey of Racial Harmony. So this is the poem, Close Quarters, Chinatown. To modern minds, or those of a different order of being, it must count as some special science to live at such proximity, to keep one's own circle discreet, all the while sustaining not too much overlap in the Venn diagrams of life, to understand that one is not a whole number, an integer unto oneself, but a digit in a spectrum of denominators. These are equations some do not calculate: the geometry of community, the arithmetic of survival. The second poem I'm going to read is titled Industry. It was inspired by this painting, Workers in a Canteen by Chua Mia Tee, which he painted in 1974 after a visit to Jurong shipyard. In an oral history interview in 1997, Mr. Chua explained and revealed that there was a central theme in his art which is expressed in this painting, and it is captured in a line from the famous Chinese writer Lu Xun, and it goes like this: 吃的是草，挤出来是奶, which translates as what is eaten is grass, what is squeezed out is milk. Drawn from the observation that cows eat wild grass and then go on to produce fine, wholesome milk, conveying the idea that from the simplest of meals, like this canteen break at Jurong Shipyard, the product of labor can turn out to be immensely valuable. The poem that I wrote in response to this artwork is infused or injected, if you like, with the sensibilities and sentiments of having survived COVID-19 so far. It is also in some ways what I call an EDB poem, in that it uses concepts and jargon terms of economic development that I used to use and revise constantly on a daily basis when I worked for the Economic Development Board in the early 2000s. There is a 48-year gap between Mr. Chua's painting and my poem. And what I was trying to share is that these workers are still underappreciated. Over the past 2 years, we have at various times expressed our collective gratitude to healthcare workers, food delivery riders. But other than the port authorities and the shipping companies, I doubt very much attention was paid to these same shipyard workers. So this is the poem, Industry. Industry 2.0, we dared to dream, to do. Every day at the EDB, our helicopter visioned PowerPoints animating value propositions, presenting lists of unique selling points, incentives to create the future, never with much land, but always a magnet for capital. Investing in upskilling manpower, better, faster, ever confident in your industry. Jurong, mocked as Go's folly, vindicated later by workers like you, reassembling injured ships, sometimes risking breaking your own limbs so that the backbone of our dear Lion City's tiger economy could be manufactured on your backs, to relaunch the old maritime Silk Road's cargo from spices to semiconductors. But now, with supply chains so backed up, amidst as much infectious zeal for growth, this canteen's still your go-to daily joy. So again, it's left to poetry and art, life's non-essentials, to inject the essential booster anew, even if it won't go viral, of saluting you, our unsung heroes, unheralded frontliners of an earlier age. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Buck Song. Next, we are going to be hearing from Madeline Lee.
Thanks, Shu Hoong. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really thinking you're here to hear us rather than because it's raining outside. Anyway, as Shu Hoong mentioned, I was the first poet in residence in the gallery. Well, actually, it's my fault that I'm the first writer in residence here. And I spent some time looking at all the galleries, and I actually didn't do anything about it. And then I panicked because the time was running out. And I sat in the cafe downstairs one afternoon after looking again. And you know, the galleries, you have to see it. When I say the galleries, it'd be like the separate galleries. You have to look at the paintings again and again. And that's the wonderful part about the residency. You could come in here and take your time again and again and look at the paintings. And different things stick with you. And also the parking was free. But so my book ended up being in sort of 5 long arcs, and each arc came off a particular gallery. So the Singapore Gallery, the DBS Singapore Gallery is over there to my right, and in it are all the important Singapore artists. And out of this series came the arc. In the book, it's called Apa Nama, which is really very bad Malay. I will explain why. But, and the whole arc was talking about really identity of a very young nation, and in the context of our artwork and what the artist tried to do. So the whole sort of theme of identity, well, I hope is represented in the arc. But out of this one came a very large piece, and it would not fit in this arc, so it became its very own arc. Later you will hear why. And this is the first poem I'm going to read today. It is after a Chua Mia Tee painting, the very famous National Language. Okay, there it is. You know, in itself, it's a fascinating tableau, but really where I was coming from was, other than the fact that I stood in front of it and I thought, uh-oh, what can I write about this? Then I thought of my own Bahasa Melayu classes, and I'm old enough to have gone through the trilingual stage in our education system, where I had to take, obviously, English, Chinese, and then the third language, Malay. I was still in primary school, and I was very bad at it, hence the title of the whole arc is not very good. And I stood there and I thought, so of course I didn't really enjoy these classes, and I thought, while looking at the paintings, what must go through these people's heads as they are learning the national language. And so here comes the poem. In a place of pride, in the pride of place, is our national language, mute and silent. Tegu wears a darker sheen set against a shirt in brighter white, as if to differentiate. He is older, has the mustache, and the requisite not one, but two pens in his shirt pocket. He holds a pencil or ruler or chalk. It's hard to tell. He is somewhat in the shadow. A Chinese boy, bespectacled, holding a book, turned to the lesson of the day, saying his name. What is your name? Siapa nama kamu? Only it is hard to say his Teochew name with Bahasa intonation. His thoughts distracted. He has only recently lost a parent, the coarse jute square still pinned to his left sleeve. And if only a king next to him will stop twirling his pencil. The girl in the blue-green dress with a mandarin collar grins as she's the only one whose parent can afford the new edition of the buku text. Up front, the boy in the used-to-be white, now gray shirt prays he does not get picked. He strikes a confessional pose, having sworn on Tegu's dictionary. The trick in a low teacher-to-student ratio class is to cultivate looking askance, approximately 15 degrees to one side, preferably looking about 2 feet from one's nose into the near field, always looking meaningfully, always looking sincerely at nothing. Even better if aided by a pair of cat's eye reading glasses. On close inspection, when asked about our national language, one finds everyone looking everywhere but at themselves, wishing they would vanish. Like the girl in the red floral skirt, who has hidden herself almost completely from view. Thank you. The next poem I'm going to read is called Tegu. When asked to pick 2 poems or write 2 poems, I decided to be lazy and I picked 2 poems. And this is the second one, which depicts a scene of street hawkers fleeing the scene. It's part of the sort of identity series, and it was to depict, the shift from not so many rules to many rules. And it's a shift of regime, it's a shift of nation building, it's a shift of becoming a country of our own. But after I picked this piece and it got printed and everything, I realized it's not even Chua Mia Tee. So I need to tell you the artist name. Oh, cannot see, wait. Kwa Sia Yong, painted in 1965. Okay, so it's called Tegu, which is a Malay word for inspector, something like that, or people who come and scold you and throw you in prison. Okay, Tegu. In this new world, unlicensed is unnamed, unspoken, coded, admonished. The inspector comes, the street hawker runs. It's the first one.
Thanks, Madeline. Next up, it's going to be Isa Kamari. I think I will be helping him to read the English translations for the 2 poems that he will be reading out in Malay.
Thank you. Thank you, Shu Hoong. The inspiration for the first poem, Kata, I actually chosen to read the poem in Malay because I like to share the musical dimension of the Malay language to all of you. The quality of Malay language is very auditory, so I think with the rhythm, with the tempo, especially for the second poem later on, which is a mantra, which I want to share with you. But the first one is called Kata. Kata. Mereka kata, kata itu Tuhan yang dikitabkan, yang dialamkan, yang dicahayakan, yang dimasyarakatkan. Kita pula cuba menuhankan kata, mengatakan Tuhan yang dibaca dalam kitab, yang direnung pada alam, yang terpancar dalam hati, yang berakar pada budaya. Antara mereka dengan kita adalah perang dan damai. Antara kata Tuhan dengan kata yang dituhankan, yang mati dalam diam, yang diam dalam mati, kiamat dalam kewujudan, kewujudan dalam kiamat, makna dalam keasingan, keasingan dalam makna. Terima kasih. Thank you. That's the first poem.
Words. They say the word is God himself, printed in the holy book, manifested in nature, illuminated with light, proliferated among men. But we try to turn words into gods, declaring the godlike, what is read in books, what is contemplated in nature, what is radiated in the heart, what is rooted in culture. Between them and us there is war and peace, between the words of God and words made gods, those who die in silence, those who are silent in death. Annihilation in existence, existence in annihilation, meaning in alienation, alienation in meaning. Thank you.
Thank you. The second poem is Besi in Malay. Besi. Asal besi bukan besi. Besi berasal dari kalimat. kalimat berasal dari besi tinggal besi tanpa ditempa. Tempa bermula dalam api. Api melentur keras logam. Logam dilipat dan dihentam berulang-ulang, berlapis-lapis. Menyaring yang murni perlu radang liar bara. Pukulan demi pukulan, akhirnya besi bercerita dalam taburan bunga pamor. Bilah dicelup ke dalam air. Hasrat beruap menerawang, menembusi 7 lapisan udara. Asal besi bukan besi. Besi berasal dari hanya Empu Bestari bijak memilih baja besi. Hanya Empu berani mampu berkawan dengan api. Hanya Empu berilmu mencorak pamur indah bertuah. Pusaka kembali pada tuannya, kersani kembali pada lahut. Thank you, terima kasih.
I think this is really a tough act to follow. I will try, but I can't guarantee the same sound effects. Yeah. Iron. The source of iron is not iron. The source of iron is the mantra. The source of the mantra is who? Iron stays iron without forging. Forging begins in fire. Fire bends hard metal. Metal is folded and pounded again and again, layer after layer. Sieving out the essence, craving the wild rage of embers. Strike after strike. Finally, iron speaks, scarred with patterns. The blade is dipped in water. Chiss, chiss, chiss. Desire steams like a daydream, piercing 7 layers of air. The source of iron is not iron. The source of iron is who? Only the wise master knows how to choose the ore. Only the brave master knows how to befriend fire. Only the learned master knows how to pattern the blade. The heirloom returned to its master. Iron returned to the divine. Who? Jesus. Thank you. Yeah, it's very strange that when I was reading the text beforehand, I never knew how the sound was going to be like until I heard what Isa had done with his poem. So obviously, it's much more dramatic in the original language. Following Isa's 2 poems, I'm going to get Pheng to read her selected 2 poems. Yeah?
Thank you, Shu Hoong. Good afternoon, everyone. We're very happy to see you here today. When I started out writing and had to read poems in public, I remember the times when Edwin will bear this out. The readers of poetry used to outnumber the audience. So really good to see so many of you here. That was back in the 1970s, the late 1960s and 70s. I'm never used to reading before a crowd, but I'll try my best. In response to Mr. Chua Mia Tee's paintings, I don't respond to just one of them, but I think to many of them. Some of the very well-known ones, which I mentioned in the poem I've written, struck me in a certain way, okay, which I'll try and enlighten somewhat, elaborate on in this poem. But like I think what Buck Song said just now, if you look up Wikipedia for social realism, you find the definition there, and you find a long list of artists who are painters, all the way back to Renaissance times. But for writing, there are very few, and for poetry, practically none. So you do find it in novels, in plays, in films, movies, and so on. But poetry, I was thinking, goodness, if social realism is a kind of representation in art of something which is recognizably of common life at a certain historic time, then the poem that comes to my mind straight away is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And the prologue, I do not know how many of you are familiar with that work, but the portraits that Chaucer presents there are a very interesting assortment of people known to him in those days. And the other names that came to me as I thought about, why is it we can't name any poetry that can be called, in the genre of social realism? What about the protest songs of the 1960s? What about Bob Dylan and his friends? And they spoke about their times. They had something to say about society. Wouldn't that count for poetry? I hope we are still getting that sort of thing happening now, because the world is in such a terrible state. But I'm sorry to say, a lot of the songs I hear now, I can't even make out the words. I don't know about you, but frankly, I can't make out the words. And they're very repetitive. They're very repetitive. If only I knew what they were repeating, though. So anyway, I think that any painter who decides to choose the style of social realism invests a lot of emotion in his work. When I think of some of the well-known painters in the past, people like Caravaggio, Goya, a series of war paintings and so on, there's something immediately striking about what you see in their paintings. And it's also perhaps true that as human beings, we are easily touched by suffering of other human beings. So when an artist decides to draw his subjects from the more depressed aspects of human life, that is something likely to touch him as much as it will touch his audience. I feel this is the case with Mr. Chua's paintings as well. And what also struck me about his paintings, two of which you've seen flashed on the screen just now, the workers in the canteen and Siapa Nama Kamu, the kind of energy I see in his paintings tells me of the investment of feelings and emotions that he has put into that work, because to some extent he empathizes with his subject. And this poem I wrote when asked by the gallery to do for this reading deals with this aspect of the kind of artist who gives so much of himself into his painting simply because he does identify so much and feel so much for his subjects. So this is, I call it living art. It has no end, the life in art. Time may mark the quieting of a heartbeat. The shutters fall in windows and eyes that need light to see. Yet, defying darkness, creation does not cease, but takes on trust a never-ending power of seeing, that even darkness may be visible in every sense as our senses bloom in the living plenitude of art. History means embracing what must pass. It's said an undiscriminating thief takes everything. The master painter knows he loses nothing. I see what lives despite time's thieving. It is not only that we recognize what we've lived. Onlookers have but fleeting touches of the canvas. What lives is more than skill in capturing the real. I feel a human pulse in these scenes, the energy of being drawn into the soil of common life, the social instancing, holding down historical time. In a moment, Zhen Shan Mei, melding to frame an illumination, an immersion into that space where the very lifeblood of the artist honors his canvas. In the bleeding carmine veins, tanned skins and shadow eyes, sallow light in plasma bright canvas is the living palette of the artist. He mixes original clay, the rich seams of his organic self, the passion of his life, for the daily transfusion of his being into art. This is a gift to us beyond price, beyond cost. Astonishing, this transforming art into life when we know how to see, drawing us into the warm muscle of each brush stroke and line, one life entering many. Us becoming the leaping spirit of the declaiming actor, students set with their watchful teacher in historic time, laborers bound in harsh heat or shadow, schoolboys freed to fly forever, Superman or Tarzan in a magic box. These make no appeal for praise or prize or wonder, but offer a life in paint uncommonly fulfilling. The extraordinary, hidden in full view mystery of the sacrifice upon the altar of art, the painter himself. I was asked by the gallery to read today one of my poems which has already been published. And this one is taken from the collection which was done in collaboration with my artist friend, Dr. Ho Chi Lik, who did the drawings, and I wrote the poems to accompany the drawings. The drawings came first, okay? Dr. Ho is a prolific painter. He has about 400 paintings on this theme, which is common life. That's the name of this collection. And although I did not think of it in that way, when I was asked by the gallery to this reading, I actually realized that a lot of the drawings here and my poems, they are part of common life. They are, in a sense, social realist paintings and poems. So this a particular one is called Cardboard. It's quite short. In fact, all of them are quite short, all the poems here. As I said, the paintings came first because one day Dr. Ho showed me his collection of works, which was still ongoing because he was still walking around the neighborhoods, the HDB blocks, drawing what he could see. And these are just done with crayons, the crayons on paper, right? And some of them touched me very much, so I felt that I could say something about those. And in a sense, the poems came to me faster than any poem ever did, because I'm really a very bad, undisciplined writer. I can go for years without writing anything, any poem. You know, I have big gaps of non-writing in my life. But this, I wrote about nearly 100 poems in something like 2 years, you know, responding to Dr. Ho's drawings. So this was quite a fruitful collaboration between us, and I thoroughly enjoyed what I was doing with these pieces. Anyway, it's called Common Life, and I think you will recognize this painting and what I'm about to say about it in the, I don't know if you can see that very well, the thing on the screen. But, okay, Cardboard. She has made her pile, in a manner of speaking. This is her hall, so much it towers over her, but the hoard is mostly cardboard. Boxes of nothing, collected day after day after day, and at night she measures and builds her worth in grams of hope. But it's the same story. Dreams imploding in the scale's decline towards age and loss. Herself buried at ground zero under the mountain of emptiness and worry. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pheng. Obviously, this painting, even though it's not by Mr. Chua, I think it really embodies the spirit of what some of the paintings that you might have seen in the gallery upstairs of Mr. Chua painting portraits of the common people, including construction workers and all that. Yeah. Last but not least, we're gonna welcome Prof Tambu to read 2 of his poems.
Both the poems are based on paintings by... Oh, I've got to hold this here, is it? Both the poems are based on paintings by Mr. Chua. And I wanted to meet Mr. Chua. He's Teochew, my mother is Teochew, and there was a link there. Because I remember the time when if you didn't, a Teochew didn't marry a Teochew, they would say Chue Boa. You couldn't find anybody. So I met Mr. Chua, and the pleasure is that Mr. Chua's daughter, Dr. Chua, is here with us. She's right here, right in front. She's a surgeon, and I'll never forget the fact that she said, I have his hands steady. They don't move unless I tell them to move. That's what you told me, among the things I remember. And she still continues her surgery. Is my son-in-law here? Has Ben come? Ben? No. Oh, you're there, right at the back. You see, this is one of the few occasions when I read with both my children and my son-in-law present, because they are medical types and they are quite busy and they seldom can come. Now, when I met Mr. Chua, his daughter was there, and it was a very pleasant evening, a very pleasant afternoon. It was in this building. Now, you see, for me, coming here to this building and seeing all these things is a real experience, because this floor was very rough when this was the municipality of Singapore. And that corner at the end was where the Ministry of Culture was, right at that corner. Then there was a road there. On the other side was the Chief Justice entrance, and only he was dropped there. The other judges parked and went up. And I still remember in 1954, when there was a trial of students from the university. Incidentally, it was called the University of Malaya. There was only one university, two universities, one English university and one Chinese university. And I still remember contributing $6, pretty big money in those days for a student, to the foundation of Nanyang. And I was given 6 small little bricks. And I kept those bricks, but they've disappeared. Now, Mr. Chua is a remarkable painter. He started painting when there was no tradition. And that is something we have to remember. All the early people who wrote, who painted, who composed music, who did things, did not have traditions to follow. They were founding the traditions. They were making the traditions. They were experimenting. They were doing things. But from their point of view, they weren't experimenting. They were forming. They were creating. They were doing things. And I still remember in the mid-50s, it was only at the university, in the whole of Singapore, where people discussed literature, discussed making of literature. And so for me, I've seen Singapore move from third world to first world. Not a pleasant experience. And for me, because I'm mixed, my father is Tamil, my mother is Teochew, I started thinking from a point at which, as I told Wang Gangwu, he had only 3 worlds. I had 4 worlds because I looked at the Eurasians too. Although I wasn't a Eurasian, I'm not a Eurasian, but I mixed like them. And this is why I told Gangwu that we are the soldiers of the 3 camps. I'm quoting Wang Gangwu. We are the campsters too. We turn around to find the others, but the mirror is a prism blue. Soldier of 3 camps only, because he was not mixed. He saw Chinese, he saw Indians, he saw Malays. He never saw Eurasians. And the funny thing is that the Eurasians were pretty powerful. They occupied the second positions in most of the departments under the British. And in 1955, we were still a colony. We became internal self-governing only in 1966, when we were scolded, the English educated, by Dr. Goh Keng Sui, and who had to say we had to be thankful that we were not cutting anything more than just our salary. And they cut our salary. We were being punished in a way. But I had the pleasure of being a member of this gallery. After the first writer in residence, I was the second, And Buck Song, I'm so happy you're third one. So, the paintings I saw, the paintings of Chua Mia Tee, were very important. He lived in his paintings. Paintings were part of his life. And he observed. He observed, really he observed, very carefully. And I have the one of him painting an Indian laborer. And what you should see in his paintings, I looked at the hands and I could see the veins there. The very veins there. An Indian laborer. And it struck me as very important that he painted a laborer. If you show me in Europe, the majority of paintings, they are all about classical themes. High art. The subject itself was high. But Chua Mia Tee painted what he saw, what he loved, what he had to live with. And he moved across cultures. He was an early Singaporean in that sense. Because we think of ourselves as Singaporeans. I had to think very hard, starting from the fact that I was mixed. And this is why the writing I've done has always been from a point of view that was dual. Now this poem, My Country, based on a painting. And the painting is here in this museum. It's there, is it? The painting is there? Yeah, that's it. You can see the man standing tall. You can see the faces. You can see the difference in the dresses. Some are dressed well, some are dressed poorly. You have a mixed crowd. That is Malaya. Now, we never thought of Singapore as being different from Malaya, not part of Malaya. We thought of independence as coming to both places at the same time. We never thought that local politics would divide us this way. And in 1955, at the university, we discussed a lot of things. In fact, Dunner Road hostels with a student population of 525 was a place where we discussed very openly, and there were really deep disagreements. You see, because when we think of Malaya, we think of Malaya as the western part. Johor, Malacca, Seremban, Selangor, Perlis, Penang. Kedah, we think only of lately we thought of Kedah. And because of Abdul Rahman. Because the first real Malay leader came from Muar. Dato' On bin Jaafar. And he started nationalism, really, among the Malays. And there's a whole history there. And it's worth reading Turnbull's book on Singapore. Turnbull's book. We should know history. Because if we don't know history, we do not know ourselves. And nowadays, history means so many things, really. I still remember when we went for the exams, we used to spot questions. You know, the Great Wall of China had a lot to do with the fall of the Roman Empire 200 years later. And so when we did history, incidentally, the history we learned was nothing but colonial history. I had to learn the history of China, the history of India, the history of Southeast Asia, the non-colonial history on my own. And when I graduated, I wanted to go back to teach. I had a meeting with Ernest Chikera and the others, Suping, and that's where I lost my temper. And I had to wait for 10 years before I could go back. Because I told them, and they told me what I didn't learn. So I got a bit fed up, and I told them, look, chaps, you are my teachers. You decided the syllabus. It is your fault, not my fault. Because they said, look, you haven't covered this, you haven't covered that, etc. I said, look, you made the syllabus. You were in charge. And now you're telling me that we didn't do the subject properly. Whose fault is it? It's your fault. And this is why I had to wait for 10 years before I went back to the department. Under difficult circumstances, when the local persons helped me to get in. People like Maurice Baker, Lee Yong Ling, and a few others. People who were on the side of our people, not on the side of the Europeans. So here is a poem I wrote based on the picture, the painting. I am with you, now speaking Mandarin. Our dialects are at home. One tongue gathers. This is our land too. Our forebears sweated, dug wells for steady water, sweet with the taste of earth, good for the plants. They grew. So must all of you together build your dreams bit by bit. Put thoughts, your hopes, all you want. Overall, that is your purpose. We share and push as we can. The less they know, the better for us. Construct, as I have discussed. We are many. Small towns and cities are ours. Business and shops and stalls are ours. Colonialists have their own, far fewer. Surely. Some of us serve them as clerks, having their language. You do not see China. Few know their relatives there. This is your home, when a strong place in the world is here. Some may go back to work, but not return. So listen, think, explore what you want for yourself, for us as a people. That is the way ahead. Thanks to Mr. Chua. You see, when I was here, I used to come almost every day, quietly on my own, and walked. And it was quite interesting because I thought of Mr. B.T. Arasa, who was in the Ministry of Culture. And there were things that were printed and broadcast, distributed, which you don't know. There was a government paper, a bit bigger than this, which Mr. Arasa edited. And it was published and it was sent out, free. There was a lot that was being done in a quiet sort of way. And those of us who knew how they had to work. And incidentally, we worked on Saturdays. And we worked late too. Yeah. Now, my next poem is I just corrected the thing. National language class, first stanza, fifth line. The word took should be at the beginning. Took 50 generations, not 50 generations took. Okay? That's the only change there. Huh? Yeah. When they wanted a national language, I, as an English-educated person, felt a bit uncomfortable. And we had, at that time, I was in the Central Provident Fund. Incidentally, You may not believe it, but I was the second accountant of the Provident Fund. The first accountant was David Lim. And he used to sign every voucher. When I took over, and he used to stay till 7 o'clock every evening. When I took over, I used to have only 3 hours work. Because I told the staff, you're a supervisor, you sign checks up to $1,000. You're a senior supervisor, you sign checks from 1,000 to 5,000. And you are a senior other person, next person, from 5,000 to 10,000, I will sign checks that are more than 10,000. That means I had about 10 checks a day. 10 checks a day, including one that was $1 million, which I sent to Chua Kim Yao, who was accountant general at that time. And we had a rule. If he got a check that was accurate by 2 o'clock, I got interest for the day. And if it was after 2 o'clock, interest was the next day. So I made sure that the check got to him. But sometimes when you wrote, the machine didn't print the thing for you. You wrote the check out. We forgot to put an extra O or another O. So sometimes I say a check for 1.7 million, it'll be 17 million. No money. So I should tell the man, I said, you are dealing with the checks, you be very, very, very careful. Now this poem, National Language Class, Oil on Canvas by Chua Mia Tee. 1959. You want a reference? It's there. But I better give it to you. It's H112 times whatever it is, National Gallery, Singapore. National Language Class. Because history and geopolitics sustained our iridescent Nusantara pulse, especially its lingual nerve, we sing our national anthem in Bahasa, which has bits of other tongues. Some took 50 generations. Ingesting script, word, grammar, and poetics to enrich sharias, pantuns, proverbs. It can be swift as Hang Tuah's blade, yet ululit, dondang sayang. No, dondang sayang is a rare sweet sadness. Live court and kampung, grace adat. Satu bangsa, satu agama, satu bahasa. Add satu negara. So we schooled, see the dark left canvas patch, light towards multiracial faces, each intently focused on this brown Nanyang voice that still harangues regimental moments, regional moments, neighborly loud. Yet it raised ringing slogans for 12 million hopes. Spot Jawi etched faintly on the blackboard. Note Tegu, text in hand, encouraging his pupils, testing each other on what's just learnt. But all this has changed. In post-merger anger, angst, unfriendly gestures, that grinding aftermath marred it all. Our prodigal little red dot and all in her, cut off and cast upon bitter tides, turbulent seas, lived precariously. We restarted bare, small, and mixed. mitigated, sought moorings for our migrant peoples, cultures, orthodoxies, prejudices. So our founding fathers strategized 3 pillars: best free marketing, socio-economic growing, rising GDP, and surpluses. Semi-socialist means of sharing grains. Educate, unite, shift mentalities, our languages for roots, English to bridge. It spurs to globalize as we advancing, sing and celebrate Majula Singapura. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for sharing the 2 poems. We've come to the next part of the event where we will actually have a bit of panel discussion, and also we invite questions from the floor as well. Based on the last poem that Prof has read, there is the term lingual nerve that actually lend this particular event the title as well, lingual nerves, as a metaphor, I suppose. And if you know the human anatomy well, it's also part of the nerves in our mouth that controls the tongue and so on. Yeah. So some of the questions that I wanted to start off for this particular panel discussion, actually in their respective explanation of their poems, we've already touched on a couple of questions, I think. Buck Song has very briefly mentioned a little bit about what social realism is. And I think Su Ping has also mentioned about how social realism can also extend into other art forms, aside from the visual arts, talking about how it can be represented in songs as well as in other art forms. So I think to kickstart, I just wanted to start off with this question about how social realism can be represented by other art form. Even in Singapore, I suppose, we've got novels that are written that were kind of set in the HDB heartland. We've got novels like Gone Case by Dave Chua. In films, I think there are even more examples, right? We could potentially say that some of the films that were done by Eric Koo could even fall under social realism as well. But more recently, we've got films like A Land Imagined. I think that's streaming in Netflix by Yong Shu Hoong. And there's also another film called A Yellow Bird. I think all this could also be classified under social realism. So maybe the first question, I wanted to just get maybe Buck Song to share a little bit about what he feels about social realism being thought of as something that we are trying to use poetry to bring across. And do you feel that other art forms have got an advantage over poetry in bringing across the sense of social realism?
I think you have to remember one thing. In the growth of literature, it is always first the poetry. When was the first novel? Patrick Anderson, Snake Wine. That was the first novel written. And then Anthony Burgess, they wrote. When did a Malayan or a Singaporean write the first novel? It came much after a lot of poetry. It came much after short stories. You had short stories. So you got to look at when literature emerges. Everywhere in the whole Commonwealth, it was poetry, and then a bit of drama, short stories, and the novel came last. the novel came last. That is something you have to remember. That is what happens everywhere in the British Commonwealth. And Jerry Jeffers of Leeds University, when I told him this is what's happening, he was a bit surprised. I said, no, the poets were the first. Because why? You can produce a poem in one night. You cannot produce a novel in one night. You cannot produce a play in one night. You can produce a short story in one night. So you have to remember that. Poetry first, then short stories, short plays. Then they grew slowly. And fiction was the last to emerge. And fiction dominates now. It dominates now. And with the publication, anybody can publish. At my time, you had to publish a certain number before a publisher would take it on as a project. But now, you can publish 50 books. Where was I? Anyway, I think I made my point. So when you talk about what's happening, it is what's happening now, not what happened in 1950. That's what you have to remember. Please, you're talking about now. And when I look at the language that is being used, I tell myself, I shall not write, because the language, the old words are having new meanings. When I heard about metaverse and things like that, I told myself, hey, is this English? And what would be interesting is if I can get all the new words every year that it goes into the Oxford English Dictionary. That would be really fascinating if we can get that. At one time we did, but nowadays I'm not sure. Everything is in the computer. Thank you.
Prof. Yeah, back to Buck Song. I mean, we talk about poetry, and obviously we are also talking about how poetry can be made use of to bring across the sense of social realism and history. And Singapore has a long history in terms of writing poetry. But now other art forms have emerged as well. So aside from the visual elements of paintings, we have got the mediums of films and also other genres of writing. And how do you feel that all these different art forms can bring across the sense of social realism?
Well, this is an afternoon of poetry, and I think Prof Tambu has in a way answered your question about the advantage of poetry. It can be written a poem can be written in one night, and can be read on one screen of your mobile phone. So I think it has that advantage of being easily shared, easily appreciated in its totality on just one smartphone screen. So I think there's a lot more of potential for poetry to reach more people and contribute much more to the national consciousness, the building of identity and public discussion of various issues.
Okay, as a poet, of course, I don't want to de-emphasize the value of poetry, but most of you guys, even if you don't write poetry, you have your mobile phones and it's very easy to capture photographs, for example, right? So in terms of the medium of photography, one can also argue that it's quite immediate. It might even be faster to snap a photo compared to writing a poem, right?
Actually, you have just reminded me of something I have been trying to promote. through my experimentation with the art form of haiga, which dates back to 16th century Japan, the combination of haiku with a visual art element. Of course, everyone knows this saying that a picture paints 1,000 words. But with haiku, I have tried to turn that on its head and to suggest that a word could provoke 1,000 mental images. So, and I think there's a lot of potential to do more to increase the power and influence of words in our society.
Thanks. Any one of you all would like to also
Can I just
engage in the
add
conversation?
something?
Yeah.
And I'm not being mischievous, but since Buck Song mentioned just one word can actually, sprout many ideas. We know that the word ayo has been accepted, right? Now you can have ayo, so many contexts, so many situations. Why not? That's a springboard for stories, for poems, Some English words have gone into the OED, I think.
Madeline, you have something to add? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to just take off on your question or comment about whether there is social realism in other art forms as opposed to just visual arts. And when I looked it up, it does say blah, blah, blah. Here's the list of artists who are in the forefront of social realism. And then it also says most of these paintings are rendered in beige. Really, go and look it up. and that's the thing that stuck with me, because I'm a very visual writer. I write because I see, or if I don't see visually, then I'm seeing in my head. So that's one point I wanted to make, which is, all these art forms do cross over. It's not like we simply listen. It's not like we simply look and no thoughts are going through our head. I hope not, anyway. And when I write, and I sometimes run workshops for students, and when I write, I always say, if you have nothing to say, then it's very difficult for your piece to be something. When I first started writing, and I gave a few, as a resident here, I gave a few samples to Elaine over there. And, I actually never actually said this, but I sense that my social commentary on based off some paintings here, was really a little bit left field, because I think I was expected to write, what is it called? Ekphrastic, right? Poetry, which is like ode to Grecian urn kind of stuff. But actually, I looked at the paintings, and especially our contemporary stuff, you get, thoughts occur to you, and then you put it on paper, and that is a social commentary. I think I make some commentary, which leads to a commentary on our the times we live in, and the times before, and so on. So it's not really. So when you gave me this theme, right, I thought, I really don't understand, because that's how I do everything, in the poetic sense. So it's not really, sorry, but it's not really a big deal in that sense, because I think we are always commenting on something that we see. We do, It's just maybe not very big nation-building stuff. We will always have thoughts. Just catch them. Then you have a poem.
I think, Madeline, you touched on a good point. In a way, there are certain overlaps in terms of art forms. And who is to say that a poem can't capture a scene like a photographer does? But of course, that requires a great skill in terms of the creativity of words and all that to bring across a visual, a very vivid visual image by making use of words. But in terms of photography, since we're talking about something visual, a very iconic photo, if you do a kind of a Google search on migrant mother, and this is a photograph that was taken in the 1930s by an American photographer called Dorothy Lang. And it's a picture of a migrant, or of people living in a migrant camp in California. And it's of a woman in tattered clothing holding on to a baby with two of her children kind of huddled close to her. So there's a particular visual impact with a photo like that. Yeah. Isa, I mean, since you are also quite a visual person, you are an architect and so on, maybe you also dabble a bit in photography. And I noticed that from your bio, you tend to do a lot of other forms of writing as well. How do you address social realism in your own works?
Basically, for me, I employ what works, basically. It can be poetry, it can be novel, it could be drama script and so on. But what I want to actually project is the fact that sometimes you need to be creative to fuse these forms together. I mean, in my novels, it's always my dream to write a poetical novel. And I've attempted to do just that in my latest, The Throne, which actually has poetry, narrating a story, and the prose hopefully is poetic too. So in that regard, to me, forms are artificial. What matters to me is my voice is expressed in the most authentic way that I know, that I'm comfortable with, and I hope it will open windows and doors to my readers because I offer them a different viewpoint, writing in both poetry and prose in a single piece. So that's why I've tried to do in some of my novels, Tweet, The Tower, or The Throne, for example, has got poetry all in the narration itself, in the narrative, I mean. So this is, when you talk about visual language, when in my mind, I'm trained as an architect. When I write, I build meanings, basically. But there is always a symbiosis between architecture and literature because both are concerned about aesthetics. And you talk about balance, you talk about unity, you talk about contrast, you talk about clarity. These are aesthetic principles in both literature and in architecture. And I move about from architecture to literature in a very fluid way because it works for me. It might not work for others, but it works for me. So that's my take on the subject.
Thanks, Isa. At this point, I'm also mindful of the time. So I want to maybe just open up to a couple of questions from the audience. I know there's quite a bit of thing to absorb and to digest. All this idea about social realism in terms of writing and other art forms, and also this idea of authenticity in terms of making use of that form to bring across certain ideas about society and plights of the common people. Any questions from the floor? I think there's some at the back. I think the mic is traveling up to you.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing all your poems with us. Listening to you was really a pleasure. I'm wondering if there were any other artists apart from Chua Mia Tee that inspired your poems?
Okay. The question was, aside from Chua Mia Tee, were there other artists who have inspired your writings? I suppose artists could also be defined as not just visual artists, but in other art forms as well. So I think music and film could also be part of the influences, for example.
Do you know when I'm on panels like that, I'm often asked in less sophisticated manner, what is your inspiration? And I often cannot answer this question because everything should be your inspiration. And all art forms and all art ought to do something to you. Otherwise, the creative person more or less has failed. That's sort of a non-answer. But when I think the residents, poets in residence here will attest that they were actually quite moved by many galleries with many artists. And for me, other than the Singapore series, the Southeast Asian gallery was also very moving for me because it showed how ASEAN artists tried to bring across their struggle for identity and nation and independence. And it's kind of all in one nice little, one series. So it's actually very touching. That you think you're the only one struggling, but everybody was in those days, sort of post-colonial days. Thank you.
Buck Song, any? Okay, maybe we'll take another question and then yeah.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I guess my question is, you mentioned that there are mostly painters when you look up social realism. Is there any reason you think not more people, poets, are taking up the subject and drawing inspiration from it? I would think there's inspiration all around us in our lives all the time. So why aren't there more practitioners, more artists in this field?
Sorry, is the question about whether looking beyond visual artworks, can we also not draw inspiration from real life in things that we see around us for our poetry? Or?
I guess it's more around why don't we hear of more people who are practicing or creating art in this space, be it poetry or visual art?
I think what is actually happening is that artists, writers, and others are creating their works according to their themes, things that are important to them. They don't have this theoretical framework of social realism. In fact, social realism, well, for example, to me, it's a relatively new term that I only recently started researching. And in its narrow definition, it's actually quite narrow. For example, even if we look at the work of Mr. Chua Mia Tee himself, strictly speaking, the social realism applies mainly to his works in the 50s and 60s, and some of his works in the 70s. But as you move to the 80s, 90s, and to the present day, more of his recent works, and this is not my opinion, it's the opinion of the curators of the National Gallery, strictly don't fall into the academic sense of social realism. So I think it's an interesting exercise, definitely worth a PhD or two, to go and then research all the art that is out there and see what works could apply and which are the works that don't. And I think it's quite an interesting exercise in itself.
I think there are a couple of questions more, or yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's been a very interesting talk. I just wanted to ask about social realism. We have been seeing over the last decades, we talk about social realism and art and poetry. How do you think that artists in today's time should address social realism in today's time? Like through poetry, when we actually address, how do we face our fears and how do we actually stand up to write what we think we should be writing? Any advice from?
The question was about, as a writer today, what are some of the things that we can write about that could potentially be seen as writing something in the vein of social realism, as compared to just looking at a painting that was done, let's say, in the 50s, addressing certain upheavals or certain hardships of people of people who were living in the past. But in today's world, what are some of the topics that we can write about that could potentially fall under social realism? Yeah. Yes, Su Ping?
Time for a commercial. This book is social realism. This is Life in the HDB Heartlands. The very short poems, very simple poems. I deliberately kept the language simple because if the ordinary person cannot read it, it just fails. It can't call itself common life. But this was based on Dr. Ho's walks and wanderings among the HDB blocks. You know, just drawing at random what he saw, what touched him. You know, stray cats, lonely people, sick people, outcasts, you know, people marginalized, sad people, lonely people. And I found that very, very moving, you know. So the poems came first. Let me emphasize that. It's not as if the poems are illustrating, as if the drawings are illustrating my poems. No. The drawings came first. And I was so moved by what he drew that, you know, I wrote, you know, what I could out of it. Having said that, I think the subjects open to a poet are really without limit, you know. But if you're talking about realism, I think it's quite difficult to match a kind of one-to-one correspondence between an art painting and poetry, because to me, poetry is not so much, I don't know, maybe I'm not using the right word, realistic as transformational. The whole purpose of poetry is transformational. So when we use language to describe something, even let's say a scene that you might associate with, let's say, a language class, okay, or an actor declaiming, as we've seen in Mr. Chua's painting, a poet would deal with that differently because words can convey, in a sense, much more than what is visual. Yeah, I just illustrate, since you have the text with you, the thing about cardboard. If you could just look at that little poem that I read just now about cardboard, I'll show you what's the difference, okay? Just the first 6 lines. I'll just read that again. She has made her pile, in a manner of speaking. This is her hall, so much it towers over her, but the hoard is mostly cardboard. You can see here that, okay, it's descriptive, but it is not merely physical description. The words here are loaded to convey a kind of ironic amassing of so-called riches. And what are these riches? The next line says, boxes of nothing. Now, if you saw a painting with a lot of boxes stacked up, you don't know they're empty. But in writing, you can say these are boxes of nothing. There's nothing in these boxes. Yeah? So the words can take you, language can take you a little bit further than what you see in a painting. So it's difficult to match the two. So if you want to, you know, present a kind of realistic slice of life in a poem, you're probably going to get quite a bit of the poet's own thoughts, attitudes towards life within that piece of writing. I'm not saying that it can't be done in a painting, okay? A lot of things can be shown in a painting. But if you had language, it would take it just a little bit further, okay? The painter also brings something of his own thoughts, his own take on the whole scene, as it were, by what he chooses to paint and the colors he chooses to give the overall effect of the painting. Does it give a kind of cheerful aspect? Is it very dull and gloomy deliberately? Is it very dark and scary looking? All these things the painter can do with his paints. The poet can do a different thing, can take it further. Yeah? I hope I've answered that, probably not very well. Thank you.
Can I make a point here? You see, the poet is an ordinary person. And I hate the word inspiration. It's hard work, no inspiration. As someone said, an American scientist, it is 99% hard work, 1% inspiration. So when you are describing an apple, you see an apple there, you want to write about it. How much do you go into the apple to talk about the apple as apple? What attitude are you going to have? Are you going to talk about it as if you're an observer outside? Or are you going to go into the fruit? So it's your decision. You have to decide yourself what you want to do in this occasion. That's why it is possible for poets to write many poems about the same thing, because each poem takes a different position. So it depends on the poet. Am I going to go into my subject? Am I going to be objective? And am I going to pretend to be an apple? So it is your decision as a poet what you want to do on this occasion, or how you feel about it. So it depends on the poet. That's why some people write about the same thing. Yep.
I think we are going to close with maybe just one or two final statement. Yeah.
Thanks. So I'll keep it short. I actually brought an extra set of poems that I didn't read today, but it has to do with, somebody put up the slide of the paintings of which also Prof mentioned about the migrant worker, which is a modern term. And then the next one is these are both by Chua Mia Tee. Is a portrait of our minister, the late Lim Kim San, who is a pioneer, parliamentarian. What I did in the writing was to join up the two paintings for you with my thoughts. If there's time, I'll read it. But so you look at the two paintings, they're two separate pieces. They are 30 years apart. But the piece I wrote, which is called By His Hands, Part 1 and Part 2, actually joined the two visuals together, and I had something to say about it. I had a social commentary, many, many things in about 20 lines. So that's what I did.
In times of plenty, rolling good times, there's probably less social realism in art overall. If you think back to before the pandemic, we had F1, Crazy Rich Asians, everyone was partying. And then now we are in the pandemic phase of humanity. And Mr. Chua Mia Tee, in many of his paintings, put the spotlight on ordinary workers. And in the last 2 years, we have had our national conscience turned every now and then towards the dormitories where our migrant workers are. And in fact, today, we are literally surrounded by them. They are here on their day off, taking photos on the steps of the City Hall as we speak. And so I think in a sense, I see a return of social realism. And many of the issues which even before this pandemic had become increasingly important, especially to the younger generations, inequality, the condition of minorities in society in terms of the racial harmony and so on, many other issues. So I think we could be seeing a return of social realism.
Thanks, Buck Song. I'm very grateful that you are able to sum up this whole session in such a nice way. It leaves me time to pass the mic back to National Gallery. Let's put our hands together for all the poets here for a wonderful afternoon.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Buck Song, thank you for initiating today's event and for your presentation. Madeleine, Isa, Pheng, Professor Tambu, thank you so much for your readings and your comments. And Shu Hoong, thank you for moderating. I think we've heard a very compelling case for poetry today, which is encouraging in and of itself, but also because the gallery, besides being an arts institution, is also a publisher of poetry. Now, there are very few publishers of poetry in Singapore, and I dare say in general. So to be one of them is something to be proud of. We publish the poetry that emerges from our residencies in a series that we created for this called Words on Art, which is books dedicated to articulating the intersections between visual and literary art. Okay, so this is my commercial bit. We look forward to publishing Buck Song's poetry later this year, and we have Madeline's and Professor Tambu's poetry in these 2 little volumes, as well as the publication that accompanies the Chua Mia Tee exhibition available at the museum shop downstairs. So thank you again, everyone, for coming, and have a lovely afternoon.